think we're at the top of the hour now. My name is Chuck DeVore. I'm the Chief National Initiatives Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's my honor to be hosting this panel today. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Among the tasks that I have at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I have the opportunity to testify quite often before the legislature, write papers occasionally, and manage some of our efforts that are focused mostly outside of the great state of Texas. And among those efforts, we have, of course, become increasingly concerned about the malign influence of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party that controls that nation. I personally have had the misfortune of running across the influence operations of the CCP when I was a California lawmaker. And they pulled out all the stops to successfully quash a Tibet Day resolution in the California legislature. In fact, I was even visited by the FBI that they asked me if I had been visited by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And I told the agent that, well, probably not me, because I have this book that was a bestseller in Taiwan and has been banned in mainland China, so maybe they figured I was a lost cause. So this has been going on for quite a while. That happened in California, I think, around 2007. And at the time, it was an unprecedented effort. But we know, of course, that the Chinese effort to do what is called elite capture has been going on for quite some time. And then lastly, before I introduce my guests on this panel, I think it's just important to very briefly mention how we got here. There was a marriage of convenience between the United States and the People's Republic of China since Nixon's opening to China as a Cold War stratagem to counterbalance the Soviet Union and its rapidly growing military power. That marriage of convenience was good for both nations, but at the time, Henry Kissinger warned Nixon that in 20 years hence, one of your predecessors will probably have to balance with Russia against China, and it has to be completely unemotional, just based on power politics. We never did that. So as the Soviet Union fell, there was never a reevaluation of that relationship. And instead, there was this Pollyannish vision that somehow, if we open up trade to China, if we give them most favored nation trading status, if we allow them to sell us billions and billions of dollars of cheaply produced goods, that somehow they would begin to transform to be more like us, to become more open and more of a democracy. You would think that the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 might have disabused people of that notion, but unfortunately, for geostrategic purposes, it happened a little too early. It happened 2 years before the Berlin Wall came down. So this reevaluation never happened, and here we are now more than a quarter century later grappling with this growing threat that we're now beginning to see some bipartisan recognition has become a problem. So joining us here today, I'd like to first introduce the Honorable Cody Harris. He's a Texas state representative who understands the China threat and is beginning to do something about it. He serves in House District 8. He also serves as the House Chair of the State Water Infrastructure Fund Advisory Committee and has an extensive background in real estate and banking. He's a graduate of Texas A&M University. I knew that was going to happen. In the Texas Agricultural Lifetime Leadership Program, he and his wife Taylor are proud parents to 3 sons and a daughter. I understand that they may be here. Are they in the audience?
The 3 boys are right now.
They're the 3 boys. Y'all are going to behave yourselves, right? Okay? All right. Don't just clap for your dad, please. All right? All right. To my immediate left, Rowena Ha. She is a PhD, senior fellow at Civitas Institute right here at UT Austin. She's a senior research fellow here at the UT, and I don't know, what do the Longhorns do? They just do the something with the, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I think the A&M folks had you on this one. You were a little ragged on your response. So she is a China specialist and a historian of modern Chinese society and politics. Passionate about teaching, she's taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Harvard University, Wesley College, and St. Michael's College. She was designated among the top 100 Chinese public intellectuals in 2016 and is a well-known speaker and writer. In fact, I think she's had some pieces in the Wall Street Journal in the last month, right? It's coming out. Okay, well, you've had also have had pieces in the Wall Street Journal. Michael Lucci on the far left, your far right, of course, if we want to, turn the perspective around, since he might wince at that. He's the founder and CEO of State Armor, on which I have the honor of serving as one of the board members. State Armor was developed, he developed it and created it to enact state solutions to pushing back on the security threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party. He's been active in state policy and political work for more than a decade. He's worked as a senior fellow at Cicero Institute, senior policy advisor of the State Policy Network, and a senior advisor to the Platt Institute. I know I've worked with him for some 10 years now, off and on. He's a proud graduate of the University of Notre Dame. So let's get going. Michael, since I just mentioned your name, let's start with you. We know, or we expect, that China is, of course, a national security threat in sort of the military and espionage context, right? National level. What's happening at the state level that has you so concerned, and some of the lawmakers that you speak to, and what are we doing about it?
Thank you, Chuck. So at the state level, there's a very focused, concerted subnational strategy. They actually consider the states to be sort of the soft underbelly of American governance, because states are rightfully focused on economic development. They should be. They absolutely should be. And so through investment, through sending students to universities, and through other more direct influence operations, what they want to do is they want to capture, as Chuck mentioned, elite capture at the state level, state policymakers. And they have a phrase, it's called use the local to surround the central. And so the local is the states, the central you want to surround is DC. So if you're influencing state lawmakers, if you're putting investments in congressional districts and things like this, that's going to influence policymakers in DC. Furthermore, in our system, our federalist system, the states are very important to influence on their own. I mean, hugely important to influence on their own. And so we essentially kind of look at their strategy on this area of influencing state government, but also they have a civil-military fusion strategy, which we could talk about in a little bit. We're just looking at doing a full reversal of all their subnational strategies. We're in 15 states right now. We're passing legislation on about 15 different policy issues. I'll give you one example. There was a company called Fufeng. You might have heard of them, Fufeng Group. They were kicked out in North Dakota a year ago because they set up shop about 12 miles from Grand Forks Air Force Base. State officials asked the Air Force, what do you think of this? And the Air Force wrote a letter saying, this is an absolute no-go. This is a huge national security threat to our operations in this area. So Fufeng popped up in Indiana, and we found that out because we were running legislation on land purchases, which you've seen, that, that's a more common piece. And the EcoDeco in Indiana came to the sponsoring center and said, you can't do this bill. We've got 11 deals worth $14 billion that will be thwarted if you do this bill. And so I asked the senator, ask one name. Name one of these companies. They offered Fufeng Group. And they were trying to put Fufeng 10 miles from a military installation in Indiana, practically on top of the most important rail lines in that part of the country. In northwest Indiana is where it was, LaPorte County. So somehow, no one in Indiana's EcoDeco found Google to search the name of this company to see that they were kicked out in North Dakota a year earlier. There are 10 other companies out there in Indiana. I think that our legislation might clip some of them, but it's not totally clear. So we're doing work like that in about 15 states right now. I think we'll be 30 in 2025. We'll be in 30 states. Most importantly, we'll be here when the legislature convenes in Texas.
Representative Harris, what keeps you up at night as a Texas lawmaker and someone who has taken an oath not only to the Constitution but to the Constitution of the state of Texas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Chuck, thanks for having me here. But one thing real quick, if the CCP thinks that the state of Texas is a soft underbelly of the nation, they've got another thing coming. I guarantee you that. But just being part of this discussion before we got started, it's evident to me that legislators were not quite aware of the level of the threat. that there is. And so this discussion is incredibly important, and I'm really glad to see State Representative Kerry Isaac and future State Representative Joanne Schaffner here for the discussion as well, and look forward to working with them on solutions to this, and y'all at the same time. You know, last session, I filed a bill that dealt with foreign ownership of Texas agricultural land. And being in the ag industry and being very close to it, that to me, food and fiber, the basic needs of our people, we can't afford to let foreign nations own that, especially hostile foreign nations like China. Worked really closely with Senator Kolkhorst in the Senate on that, and unfortunately we never got anything sent to the governor's desk, but I definitely look forward to continuing that discussion, and that's why these policy summits that y'all are putting on are so important, because as you know, it's one thing to say, to have a bumper sticker slogan that sounds really good to the voters, but to develop good, effective policy that actually accomplishes that goal is a very, very difficult thing to do. And so that's really what keeps me up at night, is how do we accomplish the goals of the voters of the state of Texas by passing effective, good policy at the same time. So that would be how I'd answer that.
Great, thank you. Rowena, you're an expert in Chinese Communist Party propaganda efforts and techniques. You're also a historian of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. Could you explain to us, how is it that the Chinese Communist Party works to try to convince us that they're not a threat? I mean, what are some of the techniques, and what have you observed?
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Thank you for being here, and I would like to thank TPS for putting this together and welcome everyone. I'm a historian. Maybe I can tell narrative and stories to explain to you how things work. First of all, it means so much for me to be in this room and in this building today, because last year around the same time, for the first time I came to Austin and I was invited to this distinguished lecture, and at that time I would have never thought that a year after, this is where I call home, after being expelled from my homeland and lost my academic position as associate professor of history at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And people in this country often talk to me about, oh, you must be studying something controversial, sensitive, and all of this, and that's why you end up in your position. You must be a radical or anything like that. But that's why in Hong Kong, when the Financial Times broke the news, what happened to me the day after I was expelled, people were asking, like my students were asking, my colleagues were asking, geez, like look at her, right? Rowena, are we talking about the same Rowena? Like all that she did is she read and write, she teach, she cook, and she watched Law and Order in the evening. How is it possible that she's the one who got expelled? But I think for those of us who study political campaigns throughout the party history, like I teach about all of this since the 1930s when the CCP came into power, that's exactly what they always do, right? They don't have a clear red line, as people always call that. There's never a red line. Killing the chicken to warn the monkey, as the Chinese says, 杀鸡儆猴. They pick one randomly, or maybe not randomly, or they pick the one who's not radical, then everybody will shut up for decades and will not speak anymore. So that kind of rule by fear, not rule of law, is actually very effective. If you look at all the major, get back to Chuck's question, how they control people's thinking and perspective, how they shape public opinion. So if you look at what we call the political socialization agencies, meaning the media, church, schooling, and textbooks, everything was centrally state controlled by the government. If you go beyond the line, and even the internet, right? So we talk about internet and social media and apps all these days, but Facebook is banned in China, Twitter is banned in China, YouTube is banned in China, and you are now telling me that, oh, I need the freedom to use certain apps in your country and things like that. So I think in order to understand this, we need to see the bigger picture. Like last year when I was here, my director, Justin Dyer, when I told him about my situation, when I told him that I just got crucified by the major newspaper, Communist Party newspaper in Hong Kong, calling me working for the American government and all of those. So I felt so helpless, and Justin was the one who supported me, and that's why I'm here speaking to you today. I think action speaks louder than words. People talk about what we can do and all sorts of things, but when an individual, when a human being is just right in front of you, I eventually, all my books were removed from the public library in Hong Kong, and then I was banned, and I could not be reminded of the sense of helplessness on the day of the massacre in 1989. All that I did was a historian. Many of you probably still remember what happened on that fateful night that changed the fate of so many of us, right? My generation, we took to the street not because of anger, not because of hope, not because of grievances. We took to the street because of hope, because of the hope for reform and democratization, right? That's why we had that statue of the goddess of democracy set up in Tiananmen Square, because we wanted to have the statue of liberty in this country. And in my life, twice, right? First time, 1989, when the tanks rolled over to Tiananmen Square, they crashed that goddess of democracy. And then we have a miniature of the goddess of democracy in my university in Hong Kong, and 2 years after the passing of the national security law in Hong Kong, in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve, they removed that again. So each time you felt that as an individual facing this power, that you felt so helpless. And people often ask me, why should we care, Rowena? I remember 10 years ago, not already 10 years ago, when I was giving my book talk at the State Department, right? People explained to me that we know human rights in China is important. We understand all of this, but we also have the voters' rights. We also have the economic interest. And at that time, I said something, I just said it. I said, in this global village, like if the plane got hijacked or it's a Titanic, you got business class, I'm in a window seat, but we would end up in the same place if the plane got hijacked. At that time, everyone was asking, like, can you give us an example? I said, if we got an example later, that would be too late. And of course, we all saw that example. We experienced that example during COVID, because when one ordinary medical doctor in China, when he tried to warn us, when he tried to send a message through social media to his classmates, right, who were medical specialists, and this guy was taken by the police, he was silenced. Of course, he himself, Dr. Li Wenliang, he died as well. So the violation of human rights of one ordinary Chinese doctor became the violation of human rights of every single human being on earth. So it's not just about them, it's also about us. It's not just about then, it's also about now. And I will go into more details. Thank you very much for coming here and for listening.
Representative Harris, I know that you know a lot about infrastructure, specifically water infrastructure. I know that we've seen recent stories of malware that has been found on American water infrastructure, pipes, water treatment, et cetera. Is that something that you're concerned about here in Texas, that might someday be a problem?
Absolutely, and just talking with him about this, I am concerned about it. The problem is I don't think that enough of the legislature is aware of it, or our state agencies are aware of the problem. And so we've got a lot of work to do in the next legislative session. I think the thought on when a legislator right now in the state of Texas thinks about the Chinese threat, they're probably thinking about TikTok and land purchases. I don't think that it's gotten to the depth in the minds of legislators that it's a far greater threat than that, where they can shut down our water supply or increase the chlorination level to kill children, or the things that they've done in other parts of the country, as my friend was just telling me. And so there's a big education effort that we've got to do well before January of 2025 in order to accomplish what has to happen. I mean, we can't afford not to take action on this, just based off of the information that I've learned just today.
Michael, with your state armor effort, and you hinted at this with Indiana and the economic development efforts in Indiana, what's the most common pushback that you get from lawmakers and staff when you try to tell them of the threat and the things that can be done at the state level? Is there a common theme, a top one or two things that you're hearing constantly?
Yeah, I'd say economic development, although there's some awareness that there's now a trade-off on that issue. But probably the most common thing I hear is, well, this is DC's issue. And with the Soviet threat, I would say it probably was DC's issue. With the Communist Party of China threat, there is a deep embedding of economically and through education institutions and just through massive espionage attempts that they make. They're at the state and local level. What I would say is, if DC is perfect president, perfect Congress, all the agencies are perfect, the states still better step up. That's the depth of penetration that we're seeing right now. Even if DC is doing the best job possible. To speak on the water issue, I'd refer everyone to check out Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, sent a letter to every governor this week. I think it was dated the 18th and it went out on the 19th. And it said they are coming for your water infrastructure. It gave two examples. Said here's Iran did it in one part of the country, China did it in another part of the country. It's a very convenient way to totally disrupt American life. And why would they do this? Jen Easterly, who's the head of an agency that doesn't always do great things, but the cybersecurity agency at the federal level, I think she spoke to it really well on January 31st when she testified in front of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. She said they are looking to induce an everything, everywhere, all at once panic within the United States of America if and when they decide to sail on Taipei, on Taiwan. And so what they would want to do is break our will to resist or even be able to fortify our own troops in that arena by causing mass chaos here. The federal agencies are coming out really dramatically warning the state and local level. I think that Sullivan's letter was the first time that they sent it direct to the governors and said, you guys better start moving on this. So I think that we're seeing a lot of warning signs that the feds are giving us, and states really need to pick it up and act on these warning signs.
I'm going to pose a question that I'll give Rowena the first right of refusal for, but if any of the two of you want to pick up on it after, assuming that she wants to answer it, if she doesn't, then you all better jump in right away. I saw an article just in the last few days that China launched a sophisticated artificial intelligence video that suggests that there are very bad riots here in America, that there's labor unrest, and that Americans are very unhappy and that we're rioting violently. Of course, it's not true, but when you think about it, why would you do such a thing? I can think of no good reason why you would do such a thing, but why even try something like that? Rowena, have you heard of this? Do you know what's...
This is not, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you bring up this question, right? So this is not something that's new, right? It's been for decades of Israel PRC history to describe and depict the Americans or democracy is failing, right? So that's the whole point about why they try to silence and erase the history. So in the post-Tiananmen period, for example, of course, throughout PRC history, each time when they perceive some crisis domestically, and China is facing lots of domestic crisis now, they need to create a foreign enemy, or they need to show that the other people are not doing as well. So that's why during the Cultural Revolution, during Mao's period, we were all told that the Americans were struggling, that the British are struggling, and Shui-Shen-Huo, right? They're living in a lot of difficulties. So that kind of narratives actually would shape people's understanding about public opinion, right? What they think about what they should do. And that public opinion is always closely connected to people's understanding of the nation's immediate past and also what's happening currently, right? So, and in order to create that narrative, to control that narrative, because we talk about war, we talk about all of this now only from the legal perspective, from military perspective, I think it's extremely important that we go back to the roots and the sources of what I call the politics of identity, how they try to create this identity in the post-Tiananmen period, that there were only two demonstrations that you can just go home happily and be a hero, that you can still participate in after Tiananmen, which is anti-China, anti-Japan, and anti-US demonstrations. You'll become a national hero. So I think that this is nothing new to us. They have been doing this. On one hand, you try to portray your democracy is failing, and we are the now civilization that should take over the world order and all of this. So I hope that you pay more attention to the roots, not just reacting to it. I think sometimes because we see it as a threat and react to certain things. But I think that in the long run we need to understand the roots, and I think that's the solution to the quote unquote the threat from the Beijing government. And I want to emphasize not necessarily the Chinese people, because many of them are also victims, as I mentioned. And I know so many of people in my generation. You probably only read about other the pro-CCP views, because that's the only view that can exist. But there are many other people of my generation or previous generations. They all want the same thing as what you are having, that you are born with, and we never have it, and we spend generations with the price of tears and prison and jobs, and of course maybe not being able to see my loved ones inside the country. And I hope that we know our enemy is the CCP. Thank you.
Representative Harris, Michael, is that video, do you think it's exclusively for internal purposes in China? Do you see potentially an application for that technology that could be applied in the 2024 election to cause confusion and angst in America?
Perhaps if they control an application used by 170 million Americans, they might be able to promulgate the idea of unrest here, whether or not there is unrest. And that is, of course, an issue where we're seeing bipartisan action in Congress, really great action coming out of the House, and we'll see what happens in the Senate. But yes, so they want to dominate. They have a civil-military fusion program. So that means anything that has a military use and civilian use, they want to dominate it. AI is a great example of it. And what we need to do is really cut them off from all of our data. Look, I'm not the biggest fan of the Biden administration, but if you look at their actions the last 6 to 8 weeks, they're actually doing that. They want to rip out Chinese components from cars. They did an executive order to cut off data. Congress just passed the statutory version of that in the last 2 days, unanimous. The TikTok move, and so we need to cut off access to our data, because they will just filter it through their AIs to create videos of unrest, or actually they want to get control of our DNA. They have companies specifically here to harvest American DNA. You could take a couple guesses what they want to use that for. They want control of data, and we could talk about more, but warfare is a continuum to them. So to them, warfare looks like propaganda videos. Warfare looks like 100,000 Americans dead from fentanyl every year. Warfare looks like economic sabotage. Warfare looks like, to Rowena's example, to kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. Remember the GM of the Houston Rockets, I believe it was? He put out a tweet like, democracy's good in Hong Kong, something like this, and that was the end of the world. NBA got cut off. You know who was watching that? Hollywood was watching that. Wall Street was watching that. Every university was watching that. So that's how they operate. These are all tactics of warfare that we don't use as an open society, but we have to understand how they use them and counter those tactics as effectively as possible.
All right. I'll have a question then for any of the three panelists, and actually I think I'd like all of you to comment on this next one. With the complete lack of any sort of organized control of the southern border, we began to see approximately 14 months ago a very significant change in the nature of Chinese illegal immigration coming across the southern border. It shifted from frequently family units that were older individuals who were happy to tell the Border Patrol their story, where they wanted to go, where their relatives were. And what you saw like a light switch is all of a sudden it was young, military-aged, mostly men coming across, often well-dressed, well-equipped. They did not want to talk to the Border Patrol, who unfortunately have almost no time to interrogate anyone these days because of the chaos. And they're immediately going into the interior of the country. And what we're finding out now is that many of them, of course, are going to work for the triads, who have now taken over good old-fashioned American marijuana grow efforts, many of which were criminal, some of which were legal, doing the distribution, having a lot of people working as indentured servants to help, make that happen. Of course, the triads operate with the approval of the CCP. So what's going on? Is this migration simply the result of the fact that youth unemployment is said to be very high in China right now? Is there something else more malevolent that could be happening? Could these be the advanced elements of a spoiling attack that could sabotage or conduct espionage activities? What's going on here?
If you put yourself in their shoes, if the states are the United States is gonna leave the border wide open, you're gonna send out forward units, basically. And so I would assume that those are interwoven with legitimate people just trying to escape. So to an earlier point, I mean, the Chinese people themselves are the first and greatest victims of the Communist Party, especially over there, but then Chinese people here. There is this concept of transnational repression. I think you're gonna see a bunch of states codify that and punish that heavily. But the Chinese people themselves are the first and greatest victims. So I would want to get to the states if I could. But I think that if you're looking at that flow, you're going to start putting in some special ops. I have kind of a creepy story. So I work a lot in Phoenix. We have 9 bills moving in Phoenix, or in Arizona, state bills. And so I'm back and forth, back and forth. And after my second trip, on the return, the late night flight from Phoenix to Austin, it's like 75% illegals coming from Phoenix to Austin because they get across the border, then they're moving them into the country. So I just came out of testimony on, I don't know how many bills we had that day, and I have one military-age male Chinese, illegal on one side of me, and another military-age male Chinese illegal on the other side of me. And so I think I'm probably not going to get a lot of work done on this flight back. I probably shouldn't open the laptop to show what I'm working on. But I would assume there's a ton of good people in there, and then there's a forward deployment in that same element. 300 marijuana farms just got shut down in Maine because they're run by the triads. $5 billion operation servicing the New York market. So I would think it's both.
You used a phrase that I don't necessarily think the crowd is familiar with, transnational repression. What's that all about? Is that like connected to the Confucius Institutes on our colleges, the police stations that we've seen operated by the Chinese? What's going on? What do you mean by transnational? Was that what the phrase was?
Transnational repression. So I think someone else on the panel can speak a little bit more to it, but I'll give you one example. There's 2 young ladies, Frances Hui and Joey Su, I think's her name. They each have $1 million bounties on their heads. One of them's an American citizen. They're both residents of America. They have $1 million bounties on their heads as they reside here in the United States. One of them I spoke to, she used to go to school somewhere in Boston. It's not Harvard, but it's a school in Boston. She's a Hong Konger. She was constantly harassed, and she would go to the university and say, this is happening. And the university would kind of throw up their hands like, well, we don't know what to do about this. And what to do is, we're doing this, you codify the definition of transnational repression. When someone here is working on behalf of a foreign adversary to really snuff out any resistance to the Communist Party, essentially, codify what that is. And so when you have harassment in the context of TNR, you just give it 10x the penalty. So if you're doing the way I say it is, Ohio State and Michigan, I'm from Ohio originally, you're gonna have assault when those guys play football, right? On one campus or the other, there's gonna be a couple cases of assault. But if that assault occurs in the context of some communist goon beating up on, say, some Uyghur, you just 10x the penalty of that. Like, make them go away for a really long time. Don't send them back. Don't send them back, because that's what they think. They get a slap on the wrist, and then they get sent back to China. Don't send them back. Send them to make them a guest of the state for 10 or 20 years, and I think that will stop pretty quickly.
Rowena?
Okay, so I think I can tell many of the examples of transnational repression, but they also did it very subtly, right? I often say that I'm in freedom and I was never free, and I'm not alone. And I think over the years, it terrified me to know that this is live, right? And we'll have a record, because all my talks, I requested people do not record me, and not just for the sake of myself, but also for the PowerPoints and slides that I used. You cannot find any of my talks online, although like I'm giving 16 talks this semester, for example, and that's the fear that I think is not expressed, and all of us experienced, even when in freedom, and you are not just free. And also at the same time, I think I want to get back to Chuck's important question. I'm not an immigration lawyer or anything, so I'm not familiar with that part. But as a scholar of exiles, I spent many hours in the past few weeks because I'm trying to actually write a book about the escape of the Chinese people, like starting from the Mao period, and then of course the escape to Hong Kong, and then to Taiwan, that Chuck is an expert. And now, if you watch all those documentaries that's available in Chinese these days, they interview these people who crossed the border, who try to run away from China. And for the first time since Tiananmen, because I've been attacked for so many years now, the younger generation call me national traitor, right? They call me prostitutes for Americans. They always threaten to gang rape me sometime because of what I'm doing for my research and teaching. So after all these intimidations, I didn't understand where this gap is coming from. I thought I was doing something important to help China to become democracy, and then why all of a sudden the people from my country were so angry with me, right? Of course, at that time I was not aware of any of this manipulation of history and memory and collective understanding about what's happening in the world. But if you watch any of these videos that as I've been doing in the past few weeks, I'm so addicted to it almost. People would be talking to the VOA, the Voice of America, or many other medias about why they decided to leave China. Many of them were carrying their kids, right? For the first time, I don't know if you had that expression in English, but in China we call that you cannot vote with your vote because there's no vote. There's so far from vote, and people vote with their feet, with their legs. And they ran away, and it was, I'm talking about months of ordeal, and then many of the times that they would have died with their children, with their kids, and the moment this young man, he's around my age, and then the moment the woman, he didn't want to talk to the journalist at first, and then when she saw her ID, and then Voice of America, and immediately he said that I came here for freedom. I have enough. I fed up with it. And then he said the past few years we really saw, and in the past we have been brainwashed. So in a sense that I saw the sense of solidarity from these people, that finally we are on the same page about this authoritarian government that tried to mesmerize the world in such a long time with this China rise, with this China model, state capitalism combined with authoritarianism. And for a long time, people were telling me, as you rightly, precisely described at the very beginning, in the introduction of the panel, that people used to think that, okay, with opening up, with business, and then eventually the country would become democracy, right? But any of us, we understand that it's the state capitalism. Like, even if you're a tycoon, if you don't go with the party line, then the next day you will be gone. Nobody is safe. Even if you're party leader, right? So if you look at the Tiananmen, the premier in 1989, Zhao Ziyang, he was put under house arrest when he disagreed with the party, right? You saw that again and again and again. So from the top leader of the country, and Liu Shaoqi during the Mao period, the former chairman of China, he died without shoes. So when you don't have the democracy, when you don't have the system, we don't have any of this mechanism in democracy, eventually everybody would be in trouble. And these people, if anything else, of course, I'm not an expert, as I said, about immigration, but if anything else, everything they were saying, and they actually used their life and the life of their loved ones, their children, their wives, to show that they disagree with this government, and they prefer to live in freedom and democracy, not as the party kept telling us that, oh, the Chinese people are very happy with what we are doing. Democracy is not compatible to China.
Representative Harris, if you look at some of our other vulnerabilities that we have because of the globalization of trade and manufacturing, I was at a conference about 6 weeks ago talking about how it is we're going to get enough power to power the Texas grid. And one of the panelists mentioned that some of these large high voltage electrical transformers take as much as 48 months to be able to get on order and get here installed. So even if you were to build a large combined cycle natural gas plant, it may take you up to 4 years to even get the transformers to get the power out onto the grid. Now, the plurality of these transformers are made in China, right? And then I think number 2 is Germany, number 3 is South Korea, And then America is, I think, a distant fourth for these types of transformers that cost up to $4 million. I also understand that when it comes to medicine and drugs, some 90 to 95% of the basic molecules used to build up our drugs come from China. Are these things that you think can be dealt with or ameliorated here in Texas through targeted state policy, through statute, that we might take on a bit more civil defense role, since the federal government has seemingly abandoned civil defense in the last 40 years?
I think we're getting used to taking on that role, especially with regard to the border. Unfortunately, the state of Texas has spent over $6 billion in border security just this biennium. And as we're seeing played out in the courts right now, we're trying to claim as much authority in being able to control our border and immigration system as we can. And so that's why I said at the beginning, if the CCP thinks that the state of Texas is going to lay down and be the soft underbelly of the nation, we're not. We have the resolve and the commitment to make sure that the state of Texas and our people are safe, from our grid to our water supply to our education system. The important thing is to educate our legislators on the different aspects of the threat. I mean, it's not just agriculture. It's not just some Chinese general buying land next to a military base down in South Texas. It is far more expansive than that. And I think that's where we're at right now, is the education part. We've got to make that a priority.
Right. Michael, one of the things I know that you're working on, I think you call it a state stress test, something along those lines. Could you tell us what that means and what it is you're trying to get states to kind of pony up and take a look at?
Yeah, so we have one of the concepts we originated is called the Pacific Conflict Stress Test. And I'm happy to mention that this was reported in Politico EU like 2 days ago or something. I think it's going to be reported in the American Politico tomorrow or maybe next week. And so the concept is, remember the coronavirus pandemic, not that long ago. Every state was caught flat-footed. Yes, states have sort of pandemic plans and things like this, but it wasn't really going to have them ready for that day. And so imagine if 6 months ahead of that started coming here, say January 2020, maybe earlier than that. Say in the summer of 2019, someone came to the state of Texas and said, look, there's going to be this huge pandemic. It's going to be very disruptive. There's going to be supply chain issues, public health issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think Texas did quite well, compared to most states, but Texas could have done so much better if they had a 6-month notice period on it. And so we are now on notice. So the leader of China has said repeatedly that he wants Taiwan one way or another. So we'll see what happens. He told Joe Biden that in San Francisco in November. So we're asking states to imagine, if they go for Taiwan, what does that do here? My estimate is pandemic times 10. That's the disruption. As I said, federal authorities, if you look at the January 31 Select Committee and CCP's hearings, several hours of it, federal authorities, both sides of the aisle, are saying they are pre-positioning assets within our critical infrastructure. Mike Gallagher said it's like placing bombs on a bridge is what they're doing, because if and when that day comes, they want to be able to shut things down. So we need to be able to either block that, bring things back online, and diversify supply chains as quickly as possible through, you could do different incentives to do that at the state level. If that happens, the federal government is not going to be there backstopping the states, not because they're a failure, but because they're going to have a lot bigger fish to fry in the Pacific theater itself. So states ought to be ready for that. Arizona's moving on that, Nebraska's moving on that. I expect Ohio and North Carolina probably later this year will move on that. Texas should absolutely move on that. Actually, governors, and there will be some governors can kick off about 75% of this stress test through executive order. So I think that that's something that states really should start getting ahead. Hopefully you never have to use it, but solutions that will come out of that stress test, diversifying supply chains and protecting critical infrastructure, you should do anyways. I mean, whether or not they ever go for Taiwan.
Rowena, I'd like to ask you one more question, and then I think I'd like to take it to Q&A because I know that we have a real sharp audience here. I can see that you all look both beautiful and intelligent. Even some of the guys are handsome. Rowena, when you look at international conflict, right? And you have kind of the traditional view of the Westphalian states. You know, you've got some conflict over trade, or maybe there's a territorial dispute, or maybe there's some issue with an ethnic minority in another country. That's one thing, right? That's a traditional dispute. You could argue that World War II had more ideological origins. Certainly with Hitler it did. I think with the Japanese Empire it was probably a little more traditional, right? They wanted access to raw materials and such. With the Chinese Communist Party, though, it seems to me it's quantitatively different, right? It seems to me that there's this belief that if we don't expand at the expense of the United States and its allies, that somehow that's a threat to us, right? That somehow if we don't grow and expand, we're going to die, and that we need to displace the current system and become the leader. Is that unique to the Chinese Communist Party? Is this simply Chinese history reasserting itself as the Middle Kingdom? Is there something different about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party versus a traditional, big state rivalry?
I think Soviet Union actually does the same thing. That gets back to our discussion earlier about how they use the narrative and about the threats, about the war. Right after the Ukraine war started, you can see all these Chinese young kids reciting in their classrooms that how ungrateful Ukraine has been and what Russia has been helping them. So it's the same thing for Taiwan and how they perceive Taiwan. And that's why that I think in this case, by the end of the day, is a war between memory and then the state power. As Miriam Kundera put it, like the war of memory against forgetting is people's struggle against power is the war of memory against forgetting. And you saw in 1984 already, right? So those who control the past, those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. And that's what the CCP has been doing, and they have been playing this narrative manipulation so for such a long time. So to get back to your question about what we can do, I think that they have been playing this nationalism card for a long time, just as you mentioned before World War II, Japan, like make Japan the Japanese gym, that's what they call it, right? So they have been playing this nationalism card for a long time, and I saw that politics identity has been playing an important role in people's understanding about what they do with Taiwan, or what Russia should do with Ukraine. But I think this can be a double-edged sword. I said this like 20 years ago in a BBC interview. That's where I got all these attacks by these Chinese kids at that time. So it's a double-edged sword. What do I mean? Like on one hand, they mobilized the army and they mobilized the youth domestically, just like Hitler's ruling executioners, right? So they mobilized them for war. They have been threatening about, this better than anyone else in this room. They're threatening about, having a war with Taiwan all this time. But at the same time, when these army soldiers, they felt that the government is not doing enough to defend their so-called interests, because that's the way they have grown up perceiving this is what they need to do, and then they would be kind of out of control. So they cannot control. They think that, okay, the government. So throughout Chinese history, this nationalism can really be out of control, and then feeling that you are not doing enough to bomb Taiwan, to destroy Taiwan. So I think here it's not just a war about, because they don't think, just national interest, or they don't even think about whether the United States is going to side with Taiwan and we're going to lose, right? They don't think this way. But very often throughout history, you saw that when a neighboring country is small, and then you have a strong power, and then another strong power coming in to help them, then a war, it becomes more and more, inevitable almost, right? If they keep pushing this. So I think, and a war of World War III is not to the interest of any of us, but a democratic China is. So, but we don't know where to get there. But I want to leave a more positive note. Allow me, Chuck, like with everything so terrible going on, right? I don't even know where I would be next year, for example. So there's no reason for me to be optimistic personally. However, as a historian, you saw all these changes. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Who would have thought that there's a Gorbachev, there will be a fall of the Berlin Wall, and all of this? When I was Charlie Checkpoint, before visited the Charlie Checkpoint, I saw all these young men die when they crossed the wall. They were shot, and I was thinking, like, if they had known that, a few months later in 1989, if they waited for a few months, they could have just watched democracy and watched the fall of Berlin Wall. But it was so unbearable living in that country. That's why they left. That shows us that anything can happen, anything is possible. Every time there's a big thing happen, before it happened, people would say, "Oh, it's not possible, like, look at what's happening." But then the next day after it happened, people would be, saying, "Oh, I know this is coming. This is inevitable." So that's the myth of history, and that's why I think that they may appear to be very powerful, but I think that they are not as powerful as they appear to be. And I thank you for being here to listen to me and to give me a voice, because I spent 25 years of the best of my time trying to give voice to those young people who were violently silenced near Tiananmen Square in 1989. And then I still cannot give justice for the Tiananmen mothers. They still cannot openly mourn their children up till today, 35 years after. And people are still being punished for speaking truth to power. So this means so much for me that you are here and then you care, and you join this fight for this cause against this most powerful authoritarian government. That's not just a threat to the Chinese people, but to the world. Thank you so much.
I just want to quickly summarize what I thought was one of the main points that Rowena just made, and then go to Q&A. When you talked about the double-edged sword of Chinese nationalism and the concern that as you rile people up, that what you may get is a frustration that they're not actually following through on their nationalistic objectives. And it seems to me that I suppose could result in another cultural revolution sort of unrest, or some other thing that could be very injurious to the Chinese Communist Party and to the economy. I'm not necessarily sure that would lead to democracy, but it would certainly lead to chaos. So with that, whoa, my goodness, okay. So we have a microphone, and let me just remind everyone, generally does a good job at this, but this is questions and answers, not statement and reply, okay? So make sure to end your question with a question mark so that we can get to as many of them as possible. So in the very, very back, white shirt, right? Let's get the microphone out back there, and then we'll kind of come to the front left as we go.
Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you, Rowena, for everything you've done, especially. I'd like to just say that I worked in the Trump administration, and I saw a lot of good on the front in terms of dealing with China, but there was a strain of, let's just say, resistance from political Zen careers that didn't want to really hit China as hard as it should have been hit. And one example, in my opinion, was the use of the language, the great power competition. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. We would never have referred to our fight with Soviet communism as a great power competition. They were an enemy to be defeated. And I'm curious what anyone, but especially Rowena, what you think of the things we think we're doing that are helpful but aren't helpful, and what language we should be using in the international and national context, and anything else on this front that you have to offer. And thank you.
So this goes to the power of language, I suppose. Reagan's evil empire speech, right? As opposed to speaking with neutrality or clinical language. Does anyone want to take that on?
I would say that what we want to do is build supply chains of freedom, discard technologies of totalitarianism, something along those lines. What we want is system separation and then systems competition. We have to we are their R&D. So we do their R&D, they steal it and manufacture it. System separation, systems competition, level playing ground, they won't beat us, and they know that, which is why they freaked out when Trump started on them. And when other, disentanglement moves are made, they all of a sudden start playing a little bit nice. They played nice a little bit in San Francisco a couple months ago. That's what we want, is just supply chains of freedom, systems separation, systems competition.
Rowena, power of language.
Yes, I'm so glad that you bring up this question. Actually, it's been bothering me for a long time too. I think this is so important because they have been telling people that the Americans are bad, these people are all bad, including myself, like we are all bad guys. And I don't want to feed into that narrative that to show them that, okay, we are bad guys, right? So that's why I always feel that I cannot become the enemy I'm against. Like even when they corner me, I just do not want to become like them. And then as I said at the beginning, action speaks louder than I would not let them to have any example to fit into that narrative as Chuck started at the very beginning to describe this is what's happening. They are as bad as we are, so they shouldn't criticize us and that kind of thing. But I do acknowledge the very difficulties when you're dealing with someone who do not play the game by rules, right? You do everything by the book. You have rule of law. You have all of this, but they don't follow any of these things. It's so hard to sometimes can I just be like them and in order to get rid of them, or can we do better? So this is a constant challenge even for me when I was especially on the ground. I felt like in the battlefield in Hong Kong all these 3 years. They use all this misinformation. They have all these 50 centers on the internet. They can do all of these things to change the narrative, to attack you and to describe who you are and what you are doing and what the United States are doing, what Japan is doing, and all these narratives I kept coming back to. But I think it's because of that I kept telling myself I would not give them any excuse to say that that's who I am. And to stand up with our values is important. Thank you so much.
All right, so we're going to move just to let the person with the microphone know. We're going to start to go from the back to the front, kind of diagonally, right? And as you're getting into position, you had mentioned 50 centers, okay? So just a brief thing. What are the 50 centers? China, unlike the old Soviet Union, has a lot of money, right? The old Soviet Union didn't have a very big economy. China has a lot of money and a lot of people. So they have literally tens of thousands of people who engage on social media as trolls, supporting things that China does and attacking the United States. They're real people, and they're actually paid a little bit of money every time they post something like this. And so what I've taken to doing on X, on Twitter, is when I see someone with a low follower count, and they often have Chinese characters in their name, and they'll come after me, I'll say, oh, yeah, you earned another 50 cents, congratulations. And they'll usually just go away, right, because they are 50 centers, just to let you know that's actually a thing, and it happens. Okay, question out here.
Yeah, so we have a major problem with Taiwan, and China's basically said they're going to be moving in, and with a weak president who is not, with the disaster from Afghanistan and everything else he's doing militarily, he's the worst president ever, in my opinion. There's an opportunity here for China to move in quickly, and Taiwan controls 90% of the chips and the most sophisticated chips that are in our F-35s. And China doesn't have access to those chips yet. So do you think they're going to move in militarily, or are they going to try to convert the government and just have Taiwan hand them over these chips? What does it look like and what are we going to do about that once that happens?
All right, I'm going to take that one real quick, and then I also want a little more distance, Jairus. The next time we'll never get to the front. We'll never give them hope. So I've written a couple of books on this issue. One about 24 years ago, imaginatively titled China Attacks. Was a bestseller in Taiwan after it was translated into traditional Chinese characters. I've got my new one, also imaginatively entitled China Attacks 2024, and it's about a third of the way. I'm serializing it. So the answer to the question is, I think that there is extreme near-term danger. This coming April, next month, is the first month of this year that is the invasion window that opens up. There's 2 months a year where the weather isn't as bad in the Taiwan Strait. I think that there is huge incentives for the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping to try to go before Biden leaves. And yes, it would be terribly disruptive. We have already, there is a very high likelihood that those chip manufacturing facilities would likely be destroyed during any sort of attack, whether either by Chinese attack or by even America destroying them as a scorched earth tactic to prevent the Chinese from getting them. The last part of your question, I think there is zero chance of the current Taiwanese government folding their house and agreeing to any sort of unification without preconditions. They had a presidential election just recently, and the party that is the most independent-minded won. And so I think that path has been precluded. And lastly, every year that goes on, as they interview Taiwanese and they ask them, are you Chinese, are you Taiwanese, or are you, some mixture, what you're seeing is Taiwan is developing its own unique national identity. As every year goes on, they think of themselves more and more as Taiwanese, not Chinese. So this boat has left the harbor, and I think that at this point, the only way China gets it is through military force. Let's move a little further. Jairus, maybe right here. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm the state director for Convention of States, and so there's a large grassroots army behind that. And the question I have is for Representative Harris. And our parents are seeing their children going to these public universities here in Texas and being taught by communist Marxist professors, and they are in Aggie land as well as in, University of Texas. What can the state do? How can we as the grassroots army help you push a policy to stop these communist professors?
Great question. And first of all, thank you for your work on Convention of States. I think that is absolutely necessary to get our country back on the right track to a constitutional republic versus where we've gotten so far away from that. But as far as our universities and how we can push back, we began to do that through our DEI bill. And in Texas, it's kind of a double-edged sword, like she said earlier, of having a legislature that meets every odd-numbered year for 140 days. It's a good thing because we can't screw up too much at one time, but it's also a hindrance because we can't fix everything that needs to be fixed in that 140 days. And so we've got to prioritize when we get to session. And if constituents are the ones that are reaching out to us saying, this is what your priorities, this is what my priorities are, I hope they're yours as well. That's the best way, in my opinion, from a grassroots approach. Develop a relationship with your representative, with your state senator. If that relationship doesn't exist, you're going to probably be talking to a staffer and never have that conversation directly with the person that you elected. So develop the relationship now, not waiting until session starts, and continue that throughout the term and with whoever replaces that person.
That sounds like great advice. As a former lawmaker, I know that works. And if you're from the district, that's really what matters, right? Right up here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to all of you. So as you clearly pointed out that the CCP regime, due to its own nature, communism, is always hates democracy and liberty, and as a result always tries to be aggressive. Now my question is, what do you think, if you were to make recommendations to the US government and to our allies, what would be the most effective ways to contain the CCP aggression? I know it's a big topic, love to get your thoughts. Thanks.
Most effective ways to contain CCP aggression. We'll just go from Michael on through.
So I think a book that's really insightful, to me somewhat definitive on this, is Jonathan Ward's The Decisive Decade, it's called. And I said earlier, system separation, system competition, that's what he says. If we want to stop their aggression, we unplug them economically from the free world. That stops it.
They're the experts on this. I would be making something up to answer that question effectively. So I'm going to defer to them.
Okay, I already said a lot. Thank you for your question. And just to correct, Chuck, that the CCP has not always as aggressive as right now, right? So it's throughout, even in most recent years. So during the reform era, Deng Xiaoping were saying that let's stop being aggressive, and that's where we saw that opening coming up. And maybe another way to approach this question, I don't just ask what the policymakers, what the state can do us. Because I grew up in a country that I don't have any control or any say about my leaders. And I always ask my students what we can do also to change and to contribute in our daily life, and not just asking, depending on some leaders, and of course leaders are doing important things, but we also collectively as individuals can do a lot to support in whatever way that you can, just like being attentive, participating, engaged, and joining the discussions, and listening and understanding, and I always feel that especially this time when I came back, when everyone was telling me, Rowena, everything you've been telling us for a decade, and nobody listened to you, people dismiss you in those days. Now people are saying the same thing, and people are realizing, people are waking up. And there's any one thing that I want to say to you, please protect and preserve democracy, right? If we lose this, we run away from dictatorship. If you lose democracy, I don't know where we are going to run away to.
I think one of the responses could be, and you saw this, of course, in the latter part of the Trump administration, and it was kind of reluctantly carried through by the Biden administration, is the use of tariffs to essentially level some of the playing field between the economies. I think we're on the verge, potentially, of a revolution in manufacturing if we allow it to happen. If you look at things like the modular nuclear reactors and their ability to provide plentiful, affordable energy, and you combine that with with AI and manufacturing, there is no reason why America couldn't turn its energy dominance into also manufacturing dominance and essentially make China's factories irrelevant for a lot of things. I think that would be good for national security, and I think that would also benefit us from a geostrategic standpoint as well. So it could happen if we let it happen. Another question up here on the front row, and I think we're going pretty well in the questions. Everyone's behaving themselves remarkably well. That's good. Thank you.
We're right here on the University of Texas campus. There are many Chinese students enrolled here and all across the U.S., and they have to get their papers to come over here from the CCP. So what can we do legislatively? I'm concerned, we don't want to be their R&D arm, and that would really slow them down on the stealing of ideas and espionage. I don't like internment camps or anything like that, because there's wonderful Chinese people that I know in my neighborhood that left their country to come here. But how do we parse through the evil actors, and especially in our education system, the student population? How can we fix that?
I would take most Chinese students to be what they are. Like they just want to study at great universities. So I'll give you one example we're working through in Arizona right now. We have what's called a Foreign Agent Registration Act, but it's at the state level. There's a federal level of that. At the state level, we apply it only to adversary nations. And so what's included in that bill in Arizona is when you enroll to be a student or to teach at a university, you check a box that says, I am not an agent of a foreign adversary. If that turns out to be a violation, you're subject to fines, imprisonment, and you're kicked off campus permanently. I think that one thing that universities across America need to be more aggressive about is to kick off the anti-liberals. I mean, there are strains of ideology both within the United States and coming from other countries that are essentially anti-liberal. That cannot fit. I mean, a university is fundamentally a liberal institution, and it cannot survive constant attacks from people who are just fundamentally anti-liberal. I mean small L liberal. And just start kicking kids off, and everyone else will get the message. So I think that making examples of people who engage in TNR or engage in other hecklers' vetoes and things like this, universities have been very reluctant to do this. Students would flood to the universities that took a hard line on anti-liberal behavior.
TNR?
Transnational repression.
Come on, guy, you're killing me over there. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, from the university perspective, again, we are so much in the state of learning. Like I'm sitting here looking, we've got 5 legislators in the room right now, vigorously taking notes on what we need to do. This discussion has been so beneficial. I wish the entire Texas House and Senate were in here to hear the threat that exists. Because going back to kind of your question earlier about how you can help us, understanding that I'm up here in a suit today as the state representative, but as soon as this is done, I'm back home trying to make a living, raising my kids. We're a part-time legislature, and we're not experts on everything. There's no way we can be. So these discussions are incredibly vital to making sure that we do take care of the business of the state of Texas in January. And relying on experts like the two on either side of me and Chuck as well, we can't do it on our own at all. If you rely on us, a guy from a town of 18,000, me in particular, I might have a few good ideas, but knowing how to specifically deal with the Chinese threat in our universities or with our water supply or our grid security, all of that, it's never going to happen if we don't have the relationships necessary and the discussions like what we're doing right now in preparation for legislative sessions.
Did you want to take that on at all?
I'm sure your children will be proud of their father for being acknowledging his, he doesn't know it all, and that's such a wonderful attitude. I always feel that there's so much I can learn from other people. Yeah, and yeah, I think this is an excellent question. I myself have struggled so many years when I was teaching. I have taught in Ivy League school and small Catholic schools, and then in Hong Kong, and during with students in classrooms, and especially as I mentioned earlier, that when they're being attacked and you just don't know how to deal with it. On one hand, you wanted to go by all the rules that you respect other people's wills, but at the same time, you saw that they were exporting, obviously, the CCP version of history and narrative and attacking you as well. So I sometimes I'm so tempted each time I use my power as a teacher to fail you or to do any of these things. But I kept thinking that I can't become them. But it's so difficult because for a long time, many of the American universities and colleges depend on the tuition of the Chinese students, and then they don't want to just let them, they don't want to upset them into, and then in the name of other diversity, and then I'm not saying diversity is not good, so don't misunderstand me. Please allow me to be honest with all of these things. But I'm nervous when that happened, then they would take advantage of democracy and the mechanism in democracy. So that's a challenge for a long time for us to face and to have a balance to show that we are democracy, but at the same time we need to guard against the infiltration, as Michael mentioned, into the country.
So regarding the question, I think it's really important that we look a little bit at some of the history from the Cold War era. We would have never allowed our top flight research universities to have to allow Soviet scientists to have unfettered access to high-level basic and applied research being paid for by American taxpayers, right? We just never would have done it because we knew that they would have been there to steal it. Every Chinese citizen is under legal obligation from the People's Republic of China to conduct espionage at the request of the Chinese government. All of them. There's no exceptions. And so every single student from the People's Republic of China and now even Hong Kong who are in our universities in high-level sensitive research efforts, most of which is funded by the federal government, every single one of those individuals is likely committing intellectual property theft and doing what they can to steal the work that we're conducting and bring it back. And because they don't have the same procurement rules we do, right, they can often get into production military weapons that now take us years additional time because we've become overly bureaucratic in how we manufacture these things. So I think there needs to be a top-to-bottom re-examination of that. We're getting very close to running out of time. Ricky, how much time do we have? 3 minutes. We have one brief question. Let's go all the way to the back. Sorry to make you sprint there, Jairus. All the way to the back on the left. Make your question a good one. We've got like 2.5 minutes left, and we'll try to do you right and honor your question as best we can.
Thank you very much, and thank you for speaking today. My question, what are your thoughts on China's Belt and Road Initiative with regard to poor nations in Africa, and then their subsequent monopoly on minerals and fossil fuels?
Oh, wow, that's a big one. Do you want to take that? Belt and Road, critical minerals?
Couple things. There are other people at TPPF that deal with some of this better than I would. The United States has to revisit the Monroe Doctrine. We can't have communist ownership of the Panama Canal, which is how it currently is. So if we're going to have a fight in the Pacific that they start and they control the thoroughfare for our Navy, at least on the East Coast, to get over there, that's ridiculous. So they're trying to do that all throughout Latin and South America. Look, from a military perspective, it's smart. Like, you put in these economic investments, and then you have military prepositioning sometime down the line. We need to unwind that, and with our allies, we need to create an alternative for some of these programs, because when China goes in and builds bridges and trains, and we go in and give lectures, we're going to lose that argument. We have the industrial power to go in and do the same thing without all sorts of debt traps and things that go along with the Belt and Road.
Less than a minute. You want to have a final word, Rowena?
Okay, so it's not directly responding to your question, but I also want to get back to what I brought up at the very beginning, the free access to information. I hope that we also notice that the younger generation of Chinese students, actually the white paper movement that happened towards the end of COVID in China. So we used to think that, the students have been brainwashed and all of those, but once you saw that when they have the access to information, when they were exposed to the information, the truth outside, and then they actually would also act on it. And people kept asking, will another time Tiananmen happen again, right? So yes and no. So I think that next time it would not be out of love, out of hope, maybe out of grievances, out of anger, when people were exposed to the truth. And maybe any changes, significant changes, have to eventually come from within. And I'm not that desperate. I hope that one day the younger generation would actually did what they did during the white paper movement, to stand up against this authoritarian government.
Which is the positive side of having Chinese students in, for example, history programs. I just don't want them in the applied research paid for by Defense Department dollars. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for participating and joining us.